How far will you go for your daughter's safety? I was scrolling through my daughter Chloe's tablet at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, looking for the math game she'd mentioned, when I found a folder labeled Mr. K's Special Pictures. Inside were 83 photos of my 8-year-old daughter, photos I'd never taken, photos taken in locations I didn't recognize, and in 19 of them, there was a man's hand touching her shoulder, her arm, her back, always just barely in frame, like he was trying to stay hidden. My hands started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the tablet. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at photo after photo while my stomach turned over and my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The metadata showed they'd been taken over the past 4 months, mostly on Wednesdays and Saturdays. The same days, Qley had soccer practice with coach Kevin Brennan. The photos showed Qley in her soccer uniform, in what looked like a storage room, in a vehicle I didn't recognize, and in one that made me want to vomit, lying on a couch with her eyes half closed like she was sedated. I ran to the bathroom and threw up twice, then sat on the cold tile floor until my vision stopped swimming. I'd been a single father raising Qley since my wife Rachel died from ovarian cancer 3 years ago, when Qley was only 5. It had been just the two of us navigating life together, me working as a software engineer from home so I could be available for school pickups, homework help, and bedtimes. Qley was everything to me. My entire world. She was a bright, energetic kid who loved soccer, art projects, and telling elaborate stories about her stuffed animals. She had Rachel's green eyes and infectious laugh. 6 months ago, she'd joined the Riverside Youth Soccer League because her best friend Lily was playing and Qley wanted to try it. I'd been thrilled to see her making friends and being active after the quiet years following Rachel's death. Her coach, Kevin Brennan, was 34 years old and had been coaching youth soccer for 5 years. He was friendly, enthusiastic, and seemed great with the kids. Parents loved him. He'd even won a Coach of the Year award from the league last season. The parents' group chat was full of praise for how patient he was, how he made every kid feel special. I'd trusted him completely, had even thanked him personally for boosting Qley's confidence. Looking at those photos on the tablet, I realized that trust had been the biggest mistake of my life. At 2:30 a.m., I was still awake, still scrolling through the photos, trying to understand what I was looking at. Some showed Qley smiling, looking happy and relaxed. Others showed her looking uncomfortable, her body language closed off. The couch photo was the worst. Her eyes were glazed, unfocused. Her hands were limp at her sides. Whatever he'd given her in those juice boxes had knocked her nearly unconscious. I took screenshots of everything, backed them up to 3 different cloud services, and emailed copies to myself with timestamps. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, but I knew I needed evidence preserved in multiple locations. Around 4 a.m., I finally tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos. I thought about all the times I'd dropped Qley off at practice, waved to Coach Brennan, thanked him for his time, all the times he'd been alone with my daughter doing God knows what. The guilt was crushing. How had I not noticed? How had I not protected her? The next morning, Friday, I called in sick to work and sat Qley down before school. My hands were still shaking from not sleeping, from the horror of what I'd discovered. I tried to keep my voice calm and gentle as I asked her about the photos, about Mr. K, about anything unusual happening at soccer practice. Qley looked confused at first, then her face changed. She got very quiet, and her shoulders hunched forward in a way that made her look small and vulnerable. She said Coach Kevin said the photos were our special secret and that I'd be mad at her if I found out. She said he told her all the best players got special coaching sessions and it was important not to tell anyone or she wouldn't be special anymore. He'd said other parents got jealous when their kids weren't chosen for extra attention, so we had to keep it just between them. My heart was pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear her small voice. I kept my expression neutral and asked what happened during these special sessions, even though every instinct was screaming at me to grab her and never let her out of my sight again. Qley described Coach Kevin taking her to a storage room at the soccer complex after practice, saying they were working on advanced skills. He'd give her juice boxes that tasted funny and made her feel sleepy and happy. He'd touch her back and shoulders while positioning her for drills, his hands lingering longer than necessary. He'd take pictures to track her progress and told her she was doing so well. She was his best player. She was so special. Sometimes he'd show her videos on his phone of other players doing drills, though now I suspected those weren't training videos at all, but grooming material. He'd given her a silver necklace with a soccer ball charm and told her to wear it under her shirt, hidden, because it was their special coach-player bond. The more she talked, the sicker I felt. This had been happening for 4 months, twice a week, and I'd had no idea. I'd been working in my home office, answering emails and writing code, while my daughter was being groomed and photographed by a predator I'd personally delivered her to. I told Qley she wasn't in trouble, that she'd done absolutely nothing wrong, and that I was going to make sure she was safe. I explained that Coach Kevin had done bad things, and what he'd told her about keeping secrets was wrong. Adults shouldn't ask children to keep secrets from their parents, especially about touching or photos. Qley started crying and asked if she was going to get in trouble for breaking the secret. My heart shattered. I pulled her into my arms and promised her she was safe, that I would handle everything, and that she was the bravest kid in the world for telling me the truth. After she calmed down, I called the school and said Qley would be staying home sick. Then I called the police non-emergency line and explained what I'd found. My voice was surprisingly steady as I described the photos, the metadata, the storage room sessions. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately from routine to urgent. She connected me with Detective Lisa Moreno from the Special Victims Unit and told me to stay on the line. Detective Moreno came on and asked me to describe exactly what I'd discovered, when, and what Qley had disclosed. I went through everything while she took notes. She asked detailed questions about Coach Brennan, the soccer league, and whether I'd confronted him or told anyone else yet. I said no to both. Good, she said. Don't contact him or the league yet. Don't delete anything from the tablet. Bring it to the station immediately and we'll start an official investigation. She gave me the address of the Special Victims Unit office and said to ask for her specifically when I arrived. Detective Moreno was in her mid-40s with 18 years on the force, 12 of them investigating crimes against children. When I arrived at the station an hour later, she met me in a private interview room, not at a desk in the open squad room. That small gesture of discretion made me trust her immediately. She was professional and kind, but I could see the anger in her eyes when she reviewed the photos on Qley's tablet. She asked detailed questions about our family situation, my work schedule, how often I attended practices, and whether I'd noticed any changes in Qley's behavior over the past months. I realized with sickening clarity that there had been changes. Qley had started having nightmares about a month ago. She'd become more clingy, wanting to sleep in my room some nights. She'd started asking strange questions about whether I'd still love her if she did something bad. I'd attributed all of it to normal childhood anxiety and the lingering grief from losing Rachel. I'd completely missed the signs that something was seriously wrong. Detective Moreno said not to blame myself, that predators like Coach Brennan were expert manipulators who knew how to hide their actions and make children feel complicit. She explained that she'd need to have a forensic interview conducted with Qley by a specialist trained in talking to child victims. This had to be done carefully to preserve evidence for court and not traumatize Qley further or accidentally contaminate her testimony with leading questions. I agreed to everything. Detective Moreno had me sign chain of custody paperwork for the tablet, documented the time, date, and circumstances of how I'd discovered the photos, and gave me a receipt. She said I should expect to hear from Child Protective Services as well, as they'd need to evaluate Qley's safety and well-being. That scared me for a moment until she explained it was standard procedure in any child abuse case, not an indication that I was under suspicion. That afternoon, a CPS caseworker named Vanessa Wright came to our house. She'd been with the department for 9 years and specialized in abuse cases. She was a black woman in her early 40s with kind eyes, but a professional demeanor that made it clear she wasn't there to be my friend. She interviewed both me and Qley separately, asking detailed questions about our home life, Qley's routines, my awareness of what had been happening, and how I'd responded when I discovered the photos. I could tell she was assessing whether I'd been complicit, negligent, or genuinely blindsided. I explained my work-from-home situation, showed her my daily schedule with Qley, provided contact information for her school and pediatrician, and walked through exactly how I'd discovered the folder and what I'd done immediately afterward. Vanessa seemed satisfied with my answers. She said CPS would be monitoring the case, but saw no immediate concerns about Qley's safety in my care. The concern was entirely about Coach Brennan and the soccer league's oversight failures. She recommended I immediately withdraw Qley from the soccer program and have absolutely no contact with Coach Brennan. I'd already done both, sending an email to the league president that morning, stating Qley was withdrawing for personal reasons without explaining why yet. Vanessa also gave me referrals for 3 child therapists who specialized in trauma and abuse. She said even if the physical abuse hadn't progressed to the worst-case scenarios, the manipulation, grooming, secret keeping, and violation of trust would still affect Qley psychologically. Professional support was crucial for her recovery. I made an appointment with Dr. Raymond Park that same afternoon. Dr. Park could see us the following Monday. The weekend stretched ahead of me like a minefield. I had to act normal around Qley while my mind raced with rage and fear. I had to resist the urge to drive to the soccer complex and confront Coach Brennan, knowing that could jeopardize the investigation. I had to sleep in the same house where I'd failed to protect my daughter for 4 months. Saturday was the hardest day of my life up to that point. Qley asked why she wasn't going to soccer practice. I told her Coach Kevin had done things that weren't okay and she wouldn't be seeing him anymore. She asked if it was because she told me the secret. I promised her she'd done exactly the right thing by telling me and that none of this was her fault. We spent the day doing art projects and watching movies, but my mind was barely present. I kept checking my phone for updates from Detective Moreno. The forensic interview happened Monday morning at a child advocacy center across town. The building was designed to be non-threatening, decorated with bright colors and comfortable furniture. I sat in a waiting room while a specialist named Dr. Patricia Nguyen interviewed Qley in a room equipped with cameras and microphones that recorded everything. Dr. Nguyen had a doctorate in child psychology and 15 years of experience conducting forensic interviews with child victims. The interview lasted 90 minutes. I spent that time pacing the waiting room, drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine, and trying not to imagine what Qley was describing in that interview room. When it was over, Dr. Nguyen came out and asked to speak with me privately. She said Qley had disclosed additional details about Coach Brennan's behavior that went beyond what I'd already reported. He'd shown her videos on his phone of what he claimed were other special players doing drills. But Dr. Nguyen suspected, based on Qley's description, that these were grooming materials, possibly pornography. He'd touched her inappropriately during the positioning for drills, including touching her chest and inner thighs. He'd taken photos of her lying on the couch in his vehicle while she was sedated, some with her shirt pulled up. The necklace he'd given her had a small camera embedded in the soccer ball charm. My vision went red. I actually had to sit down because I felt lightheaded with rage. Dr. Nguyen's voice seemed to come from far away as she continued explaining that Qley had been very brave during the interview, that she'd provided detailed information that would be crucial for the investigation, and that I should be proud of her resilience. She gently suggested I might benefit from therapy myself to process what was happening and learn how to support Qley through her recovery. I nodded numbly. Dr. Nguyen said the interview recording would be reviewed by Detective Moreno and the prosecutor's office to determine what charges could be filed. She said based on what Qley had disclosed, Coach Brennan was looking at very serious felony charges. That should have made me feel better. But all I could think about was my 8-year-old daughter describing being touched inappropriately while I sat in a waiting room drinking bad coffee. I wanted to find Coach Brennan and hurt him in ways that would send me to prison. Instead, I thanked Dr. Nguyen, collected Qley, and drove home in silence while my daughter asked if she could get ice cream for being brave. Over the next week, Detective Moreno kept me updated on the investigation's progress. They'd obtained a search warrant for Coach Brennan's home, vehicle, and phone based on Qley's forensic interview and the photos I'd discovered. The search was executed on Wednesday morning by a team of detectives and computer forensic specialists. What they found was beyond anything I'd imagined in my worst nightmares. Coach Brennan's laptop contained over 4,500 images of children, organized into folders by name and age. Qley's folder had 83 photos, the ones I'd found plus others that had been deleted from her tablet remotely. But there were 16 other folders with names of other children from the current soccer team and previous teams he'd coached going back 5 years. The photos ranged from seemingly innocent shots of kids in soccer uniforms to explicit images of children in various states of undress. Some children appeared sedated. Some were clearly unaware they were being photographed. The oldest photos dated back to when Coach Brennan had started coaching, suggesting this had been his plan from the beginning: use youth soccer as access to vulnerable children. Detective Moreno's voice was tight with controlled rage when she told me this over the phone. She said the computer forensics team had also recovered chat logs showing Coach Brennan had been trading images with other predators online, part of a network that shared material and grooming techniques. He'd posted photos of Qley and the other children to these groups, bragging about his access and how trusting the parents were. Reading that detail in the police report later made me physically ill. I'd been one of those trusting parents. I'd actually thanked this monster for being so good with my daughter. Detective Moreno said they were working to identify all the victims from the photos and notify their families. The league was being investigated for negligence and failure to conduct proper background checks. Coach Brennan had been arrested early Thursday morning at his apartment. He'd tried to run but was caught 2 blocks away. He'd been charged with 28 counts of child exploitation, 16 counts of possession of child pornography, 14 counts of sexual abuse of a minor, and 12 counts of endangering the welfare of children. He was being held at the county jail on $500,000 bail, which his public defender was arguing should be reduced. I should have felt relieved that he was in custody, but instead I felt rage so intense it scared me. I started having intrusive thoughts about what I wanted to do to Coach Brennan. Detailed, violent fantasies about getting into that jail and making him suffer the way he'd made these children suffer. I knew these thoughts weren't healthy, but I couldn't stop them. They played on loop in my head at night when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake imagining breaking his fingers one by one, describing every child he'd hurt. I'd imagine making him feel the terror those kids felt. Then I'd feel disgusted with myself for thinking these things, while my daughter slept in the next room, needing me to be strong and stable. I knew I needed to channel that energy into something productive, or I'd lose my mind. That's when I decided to hire a lawyer and fight back through the system instead of through violence. I contacted Gregory Volkov, an attorney who specialized in representing victims of child abuse in both criminal and civil cases. Gregory had 22 years of experience, a reputation for being absolutely ruthless with predators and the institutions that enabled them, and a conviction record that spoke for itself. Gregory's office was downtown in a building that smelled like old books and furniture polish. He was in his mid-50s, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that assessed me carefully when we met. I showed him everything: the original photos, the police reports, Dr. Nguyen's forensic interview summary, Detective Moreno's updates about the search warrant findings. Gregory reviewed it all methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he looked up and said this was one of the worst cases he'd seen in terms of institutional failure. Coach Brennan was clearly a predator. But the soccer league's negligence had given him access to children for 5 years when basic safeguards could have stopped him immediately. Gregory explained that the criminal case would proceed with or without my involvement, but that I could also file a civil lawsuit against both Coach Brennan personally and the Riverside Youth Soccer League for negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and failing to protect children in their care. The civil case would allow us to expose everything publicly and hold the league accountable for their failures. It would also provide financial compensation for Qley's therapy, medical care, and the trauma she'd experienced. I asked about timeline and costs. Gregory said civil cases moved slowly, often taking 2 to 3 years to reach settlement or trial. His fees would be on contingency, meaning he'd take a percentage of any settlement or award, but I wouldn't pay unless we won. He'd need me to sign a retainer agreement and provide access to all documentation. He'd also need to interview Qley at some point, though he'd coordinate with Dr. Park to make sure that happened in a therapeutic setting without re-traumatizing her. I signed the retainer that afternoon. Gregory immediately filed a demand letter with the soccer league requesting all records regarding Coach Brennan's hiring process, background check procedures, supervision policies, and any complaints they'd received about him. The league's insurance company responded within a week with a lawyer named Victoria Cross, who specialized in defending organizations against abuse claims. The battle lines were drawn. Gregory's document requests revealed information that made my blood boil. The Riverside Youth Soccer League had never actually conducted a criminal background check on Coach Brennan when they hired him 5 years ago. They'd relied on his personal assurance that he had no criminal history, a resume claiming 5 years of coaching experience in another state, and 2 reference letters from parents at his previous league. No one had verified any of this information. No one had contacted the previous league to confirm his employment or ask why he'd left. No one had checked the sex offender registry. The league's hiring process consisted of a 30-minute interview with the volunteer president, a handshake, and a welcome email. They had no written policies requiring background checks for coaches. They had no policies about one-on-one contact between coaches and players. They had no cameras in the storage rooms or changing areas. They had no training for coaches about appropriate boundaries with children. They had no reporting protocols for parents who had concerns. They'd essentially created a perfect hunting ground for predators and then acted surprised when one showed up. Even worse, Gregory's investigation uncovered that the league had actually received complaints about Coach Brennan. 3 years ago, a parent named Michelle Torres had reported that Coach Brennan spent too much time alone with her daughter during practices and that he'd given the girl gifts without parental permission. The league president at the time, Donald Reeves, had dismissed her concerns as overprotective parenting and suggested she might be more comfortable with a different team. Michelle had withdrawn her daughter and never filed a formal complaint, assuming the league would handle it internally. 2 years ago, another parent named Keith Alvarez had complained that Coach Brennan was taking his son into the storage room alone after practices. The new league president, Amanda Foster, had spoken with Coach Brennan, who'd explained he was providing extra coaching to struggling players. Amanda accepted this explanation and told Keith his son was lucky to have such a dedicated coach. Keith had also withdrawn his son, but hadn't pushed further, not wanting to make trouble. If either of those complaints had been taken seriously, if the league had investigated or implemented basic safeguards, Qley and the 16 other current victims would have been protected. Gregory filed an amended complaint adding claims of negligent hiring, negligent retention, negligent supervision, and failure to protect. He named the league, Donald Reeves, Amanda Foster, and the league's insurance company as defendants. Victoria Cross responded with a motion to dismiss, arguing the league couldn't be held responsible for the criminal actions of a rogue volunteer. Gregory countered with a 40-page opposition brief detailing every failure, every ignored warning, every policy that should have existed but didn't. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and ordered full discovery to proceed. That's when things got ugly. Victoria started using aggressive tactics to pressure me into settling quickly for a low amount. She deposed me for 8 hours, asking invasive questions about my parenting, my awareness of Qley's activities, why I'd trusted Coach Brennan. She was trying to shift blame onto me, suggesting I'd been negligent for not supervising practices more closely. Gregory objected repeatedly and eventually cut the deposition short, filing a protective order against harassing questions. Meanwhile, the criminal case was progressing. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Kowalski, had been handling sex crimes cases for 14 years. She had a conviction rate of 89% and a reputation for being thorough and relentless. She contacted me to explain the criminal process and what I should expect. Coach Brennan had pleaded not guilty to all charges. His public defender, a young attorney named Thomas Wright, was arguing that the photos were innocent coaching documentation, that the children had misunderstood normal athletic touching, and that Coach Brennan's computer had been hacked by someone planting the images. It was a desperate defense that wouldn't hold up against the evidence, but it meant going to trial instead of accepting a plea deal. Jennifer said she wanted to go to trial anyway. She wanted a public record of exactly what Coach Brennan had done and a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. She said I should prepare for Qley to potentially testify, though she'd try to use the forensic interview video instead to avoid putting Qley on the stand if possible. The other victims' families started reaching out after the arrest was publicized in local news. Detective Moreno had given them my contact information with my permission, thinking we might benefit from mutual support. We formed a group chat and began sharing information and resources. All of our stories were horrifyingly similar. Coach Brennan had targeted children who were shy, who came from single-parent homes like Qley, or whose parents worked long hours and couldn't always attend practices. He'd love-bombed them with attention and praise, making them feel special and chosen. Then he'd gradually introduce the special coaching sessions, the secretive photo sessions, the gifts and treats that came with instructions not to tell anyone. The grooming process was textbook. Start with attention and praise, build trust, introduce secrecy, normalize inappropriate touch, escalate gradually. Some of the abuse had been going on for over a year before our cases came to light. One mother, Diane Sullivan, said her 9-year-old son Nathan had been so confused and traumatized by what happened that he'd started self-harming and had to be hospitalized for suicidal ideation. Another father, Robert Kim, said his daughter Qley, age 7, had stopped speaking for 2 weeks after Coach Brennan was arrested because she thought she'd done something wrong by telling the truth and was terrified she'd be punished. A third parent, Yolanda Fernandez, said her 10-year-old twins had both been victimized, and they'd been so ashamed they hadn't even told each other until after the arrest. They'd each thought they were the only special player. The isolation was part of Coach Brennan's strategy. Make each child feel uniquely chosen and uniquely responsible for keeping the secret. We shared information about therapists, lawyers, and coping strategies. We vented our rage and guilt in that chat instead of in front of our traumatized children. We became a support network bound by shared horror and determination to protect our kids. As we compared notes, patterns emerged that were even more disturbing. Coach Brennan had been selecting specific children based on vulnerability factors. He'd researched the parents on social media, identifying single parents, families going through financial stress, children with deceased parents like Qley. He'd tailored his approach to each child based on what would make them most susceptible to grooming. With Qley, he'd exploited her grief over losing Rachel, positioning himself as a caring male figure filling a void. With Nathan, whose parents were going through a difficult divorce, he'd offered stability and attention the child wasn't getting at home. It was calculated and methodical. We decided we needed to do more than just pursue individual cases. We needed to make noise, to create public pressure for systemic change. Gregory coordinated with the other family's lawyers and Detective Moreno to organize a press conference. We wanted the public to know what had happened, to pressure the soccer league to make immediate changes, and to warn other parents to be vigilant about youth sports organizations. The press conference was held outside the county courthouse on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after Coach Brennan's arrest. 11 families stood together, representing 17 child victims. Gregory read a prepared statement detailing the pattern of abuse, the league's catastrophic failures, and our collective demand for immediate policy changes across all youth sports organizations in the state. We called for mandatory background checks, mandatory training, policies against one-on-one contact, cameras in all facilities, and swift action on any complaints. Diane spoke about Nathan's hospitalization. Robert described Qley's selective mutism. I talked about finding those photos on Qley's tablet and the 4 months I'd unknowingly delivered my daughter to a predator. Local news covered the press conference extensively. All 3 major stations sent crews. The story led the evening news on every channel. By the next morning, it had gone regional, then national. CNN picked it up. NPR did a segment. The soccer league was in full crisis mode. Their president, Amanda Foster, tried to give a statement defending their organization and claiming they'd done everything reasonable to screen volunteers. She was shouted down by angry parents who'd gathered outside the league offices. One mother, whose child had been victimized, threw a soccer ball at Amanda, hitting her in the shoulder. Security had to escort Amanda inside while protesters chanted about protecting children. The scene was captured on live television. By that evening, the league had issued a public apology admitting to failures in our oversight and screening processes. They announced the immediate resignation of their entire 7-member board of directors. The National Youth Soccer Organization suspended the Riverside League's charter pending a full investigation. 3 corporate sponsors pulled their funding. It still wasn't enough, but it was a start. The story triggered a broader reckoning. Other youth sports organizations in the state began implementing emergency policy changes, terrified they'd be next in the headlines. The state legislature announced hearings on youth sports safety. A coalition of parents and child advocates formed to push for statutory changes requiring background checks and safety protocols. Our tragedy was becoming a catalyst for systemic reform, which gave some meaning to the senseless horror we'd experienced. But I was also dealing with the immediate reality of helping Qley heal. We'd been seeing Dr. Park for weekly sessions. Qley had nightmares almost every night. She'd regressed in some behaviors, wanting to sleep in my room and having occasional bedwetting incidents she hadn't had since she was 4. She'd become hypervigilant and anxious, especially around men she didn't know well. At the grocery store, she'd panicked when a male employee tried to give her a sticker, screaming and hiding behind me. Dr. Park explained this was normal trauma response for children who'd been violated by a trusted adult. The therapy would take time, possibly years, but Qley was resilient and had a strong support system in me and her school counselor. Dr. Park taught us coping strategies, deep breathing for anxiety, safe touch versus unsafe touch discussions, processing feelings through art since Qley struggled to verbalize her emotions. We created a worry box where Qley could put drawings or notes about scary thoughts, then we'd discuss them in therapy. Dr. Park also worked with me on managing my own trauma response. He said parental rage was normal, but I needed healthy outlets that didn't involve revenge fantasies about hurting Coach Brennan. He recommended I start boxing or martial arts training to channel the physical aggression I felt. I joined a boxing gym and started going 3 times a week, hitting heavy bags until my knuckles were raw and my rage temporarily exhausted. It helped more than I'd expected. The physical release made it easier to be calm and present for Qley. Dr. Park said the most important thing was for me to remain stable and consistent, to reassure Qley that she was safe and loved, and to avoid showing my own rage and pain in front of her. I did my best, but it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Every time Qley woke up screaming from a nightmare about Coach Kevin, I wanted to drive to the jail and hurt him. Instead, I'd hold her and read her favorite stories until she fell back asleep. Then I'd go to my room and punch pillows or write in a journal Dr. Park had recommended for processing feelings. The journal filled up quickly with rage and guilt and grief. Rage at Coach Brennan for what he'd done. Rage at the league for enabling him. Rage at myself for not protecting Qley. Guilt over every time I dropped her off at practice smiling and trusting. Guilt over working from home while this was happening blocks away. Guilt over not noticing the signs earlier. Grief for Qley's lost innocence and sense of safety. Grief that she'd carry this trauma for the rest of her life. Dr. Park read some of my journal entries during our sessions and said I was processing appropriately, but needed to start forgiving myself. He said no parent could protect their child from every threat, that predators were expert manipulators, and that I'd responded quickly and appropriately once I discovered the truth. Intellectually, I understood this. Emotionally, I still felt like I'd failed. 6 months after the arrest, the criminal case went to trial. I attended every single day of the 3-week trial, sitting in the gallery with the other victims' families. We'd become a tight unit by then, bonded by shared trauma and determination. We coordinated schedules to ensure the courtroom always had supportive faces. We took turns bringing coffee and tissues. We sat through testimony that was brutal to hear, but necessary to ensure justice. The prosecution, led by ADA Jennifer Kowalski, was methodical and thorough. She presented the photo evidence from Coach Brennan's computer, carefully redacted to protect the children's identities, but still showing the clear pattern and volume of abuse. She presented forensic computer analysis, showing the photos had been taken over 5 years, organized into folders by child name, and shared on online forums with other predators. She called Dr. Nguyen to explain forensic interviewing techniques and why the children's accounts were credible. She called Dr. Park to testify as an expert on child trauma and grooming patterns. She played video excerpts from the forensic interviews, including Qley describing the special coaching sessions and the sleepy juice boxes. The defense attorney, Thomas Wright, tried to claim the photos were innocent coaching documentation taken with parental consent that Coach Brennan had simply forgotten to mention. He tried to suggest the children had misunderstood normal athletic touching and positioning. He attempted to argue that the chat logs were fabricated by hackers targeting his client. But the sheer volume of evidence made these defenses absurd. Jennifer methodically destroyed each argument. She showed that no parent had ever consented to photos or private sessions. She presented expert testimony about appropriate athletic touch versus sexual contact. She had FBI cybercrimes specialists testify about the authenticity of the chat logs and their analysis of Coach Brennan's hard drives. She called parents to testify about the changes they'd seen in their children and the nightmare they'd been living. I testified on day 8 of the trial. Jennifer asked me to describe finding the photos, my conversation with Qley, and the impact on our family. I talked about Qley's nightmares, her regression, her anxiety. I talked about my own guilt and rage. I looked directly at Coach Brennan while I testified and said he'd stolen my daughter's sense of safety, and I'd spend the rest of my life helping her get it back. Thomas Wright cross-examined me, trying to establish that I'd been an inattentive parent who'd failed to supervise my daughter properly. He asked why I'd trusted a volunteer coach I barely knew, why I'd never attended practices, why I hadn't noticed changes in Qley's behavior sooner. Gregory had prepared me for these questions, and I answered calmly. I explained my work schedule allowed me to be available for Qley, but also required focus during certain hours. I'd trusted Coach Brennan because the league had supposedly vetted him and because other parents praised him. I had noticed changes in Qley but attributed them to grief over her mother, not abuse, because I'd trusted the systems in place to protect children. The jury seemed sympathetic to my answers. Thomas realized his attack wasn't working and moved on. Other parents testified with similar accounts. Diane talked about finding Nathan in the garage trying to hang himself with a belt 2 months after the arrest, the worst moment of her life. Robert described Kaylee's selective mutism and how she still refused to wear certain colors because Coach Brennan had complimented her shirt in that color once. Yolanda testified about her twins' shame and isolation. By day 12, several jurors were openly crying. The defense called only one witness, a character witness who testified Coach Brennan was a good neighbor who kept his lawn nice and said hello in the mornings. Jennifer demolished this on cross-examination by asking if the neighbor had any idea what Coach Brennan was doing with children in his spare time. The neighbor admitted he didn't. The defense rested. Closing arguments took most of day 13. Thomas argued there was reasonable doubt because children's memories were unreliable and the photos could be interpreted multiple ways. Jennifer's closing was devastating. She walked through each piece of evidence methodically. The photos organized by child name, the chat logs bragging about access to victims, the forensic interviews describing identical patterns of grooming, the expert testimony about trauma. The impact on 17 children and their families. She said there was no doubt Coach Brennan had systematically abused children for 5 years, documented it extensively, and showed no remorse. She asked the jury to hold him accountable and protect other children from ever experiencing what these victims had endured. The jury got the case on a Thursday afternoon and deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. We waited in the courthouse hallway, all 11 families, sitting on hard benches and checking our phones obsessively. When the clerk called us back to the courtroom Friday afternoon, I felt like I might throw up. We filed in and stood as the judge entered. The jury foreman, an older man who'd been taking extensive notes throughout the trial, handed the verdict form to the clerk. The judge read it aloud, guilty on all 52 counts. The courtroom erupted in applause and sobs. The judge banged her gavel calling for order, but let it continue for a moment before insisting on silence. Coach Brennan showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead. Thomas put his head in his hands. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later to allow for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. Those 6 weeks felt like a lifetime. I worked with Gregory to prepare my victim impact statement for the civil case and my statement for the criminal sentencing. I wanted the judge to understand the full scope of what Coach Brennan had destroyed. I documented every therapy session, every nightmare, every regression, every moment of Qley's suffering. I calculated the financial costs. $18,000 in therapy so far with years more ahead, $3,200 for specialized trauma treatment programs, $1,500 for boxing gym membership to manage my rage, lost wages from missing work for court dates and appointments. But the real cost couldn't be calculated in dollars. How do you quantify a child's lost sense of safety? How do you put a price on innocence stolen? The sentencing hearing was on a Friday morning. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, media, and concerned community members. The judge allowed victim impact statements before sentencing. 17 families wanted to speak. The judge allowed it. I went first, reading the statement I'd prepared and revised a dozen times. I described the moment I found those photos, the sickness I felt scrolling through them, the betrayal of realizing I'd trusted this monster with my daughter, the guilt of not protecting her, the ongoing nightmare of watching her suffer. I described Qley's nightmares, her fear of men, her regression. I described my own rage and the constant battle not to let it consume me. I asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence possible to protect other children and to send a message that this kind of evil wouldn't be tolerated. Diane spoke about Nathan's suicide attempt and his ongoing psychiatric care. Robert described Qley's selective mutism and how she still flinched when anyone moved too quickly. Yolanda talked about her twins' shame and their belief that they'd somehow caused the abuse. One by one, 17 families described the destruction Coach Brennan had caused. Some were composed, reading prepared statements. Others broke down crying and had to be helped from the podium. By the time everyone had spoken, 4 hours had passed, and the entire courtroom was in tears. The judge had to take a recess to compose herself. When we reconvened, she addressed Coach Brennan directly. She said in 30 years on the bench, she'd never seen such calculated, systematic cruelty toward innocent children. She described his actions as evil in its purest form. She said he'd exploited his position of trust, targeted vulnerable children, and shown no remorse. She noted his computer had evidence of over 4,500 images, suggesting hundreds of potential victims beyond those identified. She said while she was constrained by sentencing guidelines, she would impose the maximum possible sentence. Coach Brennan was sentenced to 35 years on each count of sexual abuse, to run consecutively. That meant 490 years total, though Oregon law capped actual time served differently. Realistically, he'd serve 35 years minimum before parole eligibility. He was 34 years old. He'd be 69 at his earliest possible release date. The child exploitation and pornography charges added additional time. The judge also ordered lifetime sex offender registration, no contact with minors even after release, and mandatory reporting of all internet activity if ever freed. He was also ordered to pay $850,000 in restitution to be divided among the victims for therapy and damages. The courtroom erupted in applause when the sentence was read. This time, the judge let it continue for several minutes. As marshals led Coach Brennan away in shackles, he turned and looked directly at me. His expression wasn't remorse or shame. It was cold rage that he'd been caught. That look confirmed everything. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done to these children. He was only sorry he'd been stopped. The civil case against the soccer league took another 14 months, but resulted in a $6.8 million settlement split among the 17 families. The league's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage, claiming the abuse fell outside policy limits, but Gregory and the other lawyers threatened to pierce the corporate veil and go after the board members personally. The insurance company settled. More importantly, the settlement required the league to implement comprehensive safety reforms, mandatory FBI background checks for all coaches and volunteers, mandatory training on recognizing and reporting abuse, policies requiring 2 adults present at all times during practices and events, installation of security cameras in all facilities, creation of a third-party reporting hotline for concerns, annual audits of compliance. The reforms were written into the settlement agreement and enforced by an independent monitor for 5 years. Gregory said this case had created legal precedent that would affect youth sports organizations nationwide. Similar reforms were being voluntarily adopted by leagues across the state and country to avoid being the next headline. Qley's portion of the settlement, approximately $385,000, was placed in a structured trust fund. The money would be available for her therapy, medical care, education, and general support as needed, with a lump sum available when she turned 25. I used my portion, about the same amount, to establish a foundation providing free therapy and legal support to families affected by child abuse in youth sports. It felt like turning our pain into something purposeful. The foundation, called Rachel's Shield in memory of my late wife, partnered with therapists and lawyers willing to work on sliding scales or pro bono. In the first year, we helped 43 families. By year 3, we'd assisted over 200 families across the state. It didn't undo what happened to Qley, but it meant other children got help faster and other predators faced consequences sooner. 3 years after finding those photos, Qley is 11 years old now and doing remarkably well considering everything. She still sees Dr. Park every other week, but the nightmares have mostly stopped. She only occasionally asks to sleep in my room now, usually during thunderstorms or after particularly stressful days. She's joined a new soccer league, one with completely different coaches and stringent safeguards in place. I attend every single practice and game. I volunteer as an assistant coach, so I'm always there. Qley says she likes having me around, though I'm embarrassing sometimes, Dad, when I cheer too loud. She's talking about becoming a psychologist when she grows up to help other kids who've been through trauma. She's also considering law school so she can put bad people in jail like the people who helped us. I'm proud of her resilience and her desire to turn pain into purpose. She's stronger than I could have imagined. We talk openly about what happened now, in age-appropriate ways, as Dr. Park has recommended. Qley understands Coach Brennan did bad things, that it wasn't her fault, that telling the truth was brave, and that she's safe now. She knows she can always talk to me about anything. That openness is crucial because predators rely on secrecy and shame. As for me, I've learned that protecting your child means more than just physically keeping them safe. It means believing them when they tell you something's wrong, even when it seems impossible. It means fighting systems and institutions that fail children, even when those fights are exhausting and expensive. It means channeling rage into productive action instead of destructive revenge. It means accepting that you can't protect your child from every threat, but you can respond fiercely when threats emerge. The boxing helped. 3 years later, I still go to the gym 3 times a week, and the heavy bag is still the best therapy for anger I've found. I've also found community there. Other parents dealing with trauma who needed physical outlets. We've formed a support group of sorts, parents who meet at the gym and talk about the challenges of raising traumatized children while managing our own PTSD. Dr. Park says that's healthy, that isolation makes trauma worse. I still have moments where the rage comes back, usually triggered by news stories about other abuse cases, or moments when Qley shows lingering effects of what happened. But the rage is manageable now instead of all-consuming. I've learned to feel it, acknowledge it, and then redirect it into advocacy work through Rachel's Shield. I still think about Coach Kevin Brennan sometimes, about the fact that he's in prison, that he'll likely die there, that he can never hurt another child. That should satisfy the rage, but it doesn't completely. Because 35 years doesn't give those children back their innocence. It doesn't undo the nightmares or the therapy or the way they'll always carry this trauma. Justice was served, but justice is imperfect and incomplete. Still, I remind myself that the alternative was worse. If I hadn't found those photos, if I hadn't reported immediately, if I hadn't fought through the civil case, Coach Brennan might still be coaching. More children would have been victimized. The league's failures would have continued unchecked. Other predators would have seen that youth sports were easy hunting grounds. By fighting back, we made it harder for the next predator. We created accountability where none existed. We protected children we'll never meet. That has to be enough. Last month, I got a letter from a mother in another state whose child had been abused by a swim coach. She'd found our story online, and it gave her courage to report. She said reading about our fight showed her that justice was possible, that she wasn't alone, and that her child deserved protection even if systems had failed. The swim coach was arrested and her daughter was in therapy. She thanked me for speaking out, for making noise, for showing that parents could fight back and win. I keep that letter on my desk as a reminder that trauma can become purpose if you're willing to transform pain into action. How far will you go for your daughter's safety? I went to the edge of violence and pulled myself back. I went through legal battles that cost hundreds of thousands and years of my life. I went into my daughter's worst nightmares to help her process them. I went public with our most painful private trauma to protect other children. I discovered that protecting your child isn't a single heroic moment, but thousands of small, exhausting choices to keep fighting when it would be easier to give up. And I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is channel rage into something that outlasts the people who caused it. Coach Kevin Brennan is in prison, Qley is healing, and Rachel's Shield is protecting children across the state. He tried to destroy my daughter. Instead, we destroyed his ability to ever hurt another child and built something that will protect thousands more. That's how far I went. That's how far any parent should go. As far as it takes. If you made it this far, you've earned it. Hit subscribe and let me know your thoughts below.